Hi everybody. The topic of this video lesson is subtraction with negatives. And working with negatives is such an important topic, such an important foundation skill for success in algebra that I've broken the idea of working with negatives apart into 4 different videos. One for addition, which you've already seen, and then after subtraction will come multiplication and division. So this one, subtraction, I call video 2B. And 2C and 2D are yet to come. Like before, this is intended as a review for people who've taken algebra before and have worked with negatives, and in this case particularly subtraction with negatives, and just want to brush up on the skill and see how well they remember what they'd learned. So to start things off, here are 10 problems that we'll check to see how much you remember of what you've learned. So why don't you hit the pause button and go ahead and solve all 10 of these without a calculator, of course. And when you come back, I'll show you the answers. Okay, I'm going to assume that you've done that you've paused, that you've worked these through without a calculator, and you're ready to see these answers. And go ahead if you need and pause again to check those answers against your own. What you should find, or if you do find that you have all 10 right, or that you have even 9 of them right and 1 mistake, which you now understand and don't think you'd make again, if that's the case, then maybe you don't need to watch the rest of this video about subtraction with negatives. But most of my students that I've worked with in algebra would benefit a lot from more practice at working with negatives, particularly subtracting with negatives. It's as I say, a foundation skill that you really have to strengthen in order to build other skills on top of it. Let's look at a couple of things that I'd hone in on to explain common sources of mistakes on this slide. First thing to notice, there are parentheses around this -1, and we talked back when we were working on order of operations with the first video about the idea that when things are inside parentheses, you do that operation first. Well, there is no operation inside these parentheses. It's simply the number -1. In fact, there aren't any operations inside any of the parentheses on this page. Every case, like this one here, that's a -6, and that's a -1 there. But there's no operation inside any of these parentheses. There is a second purpose for parentheses, and that is to protect whatever's inside. In this case, you're trying to keep 2 ideas together, the negative and the 1, so that you don't lose track and start thinking it becomes a positive 1. You've got to keep the negative together with the 1. The parentheses don't have to be there for you to do that. It just helps you to remember to keep things together. It's like putting a wrapper around anything else that you want to wrap up. There is a second thing that I want to point out. Notice that you've got a negative and then another negative inside parentheses. Now, whether the parentheses are there or not, the fact that you've got 2 negatives next to each other, those 2 negatives cancel and they become a positive. I hope that's something that you remember from back when you were first learning about working with negatives. Anytime you've got an even or matching number of negatives, they cancel each other out. So that's really -1 plus 2 there. Similarly here, that's 5 plus 3. That's -6 plus 7. This -8 here is going to be plus that 7, and so on. Now beyond that, in order to have success on these kinds of problems, working on subtraction with negatives, I'd suggest that you make sure you're strong at addition with negatives, and that was the lesson of the previous video. There were 3 different ways, but I'm going to focus right now on 2 different ways for adding negatives, the number line method and the canceling method. And both of those can be very helpful, once again, with subtracting with negatives. Let's look at this first problem here, 3 minus 7. Well, in the number line method, you would start at 3 here, the first number that you have, and then -7 means go from there to the left 7 spaces, like this says here. So I'm going to go 7 spaces left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and where I end here at -4, that's my answer. Similarly in the canceling method, same problem, 3 minus 7. Well, I've got a positive 3, that's here, and I've got a -7, I've got, in other words, 7 negatives, that's here, and I cancel where I can. The 3 positives cancel with 3 of the negatives, and what I have left here are 4 negatives. In other words, -4. The same answer that I got here, which makes sense because both of these are the same question. Well, those are the first 2 ways I talked about with addition. There was a third way for adding negatives, the commutative property method, and we'll get to that in a few slides. But before I do, I want to point out one other idea, something called the subtraction rule. And you might be able to tell from the look of this slide that I've taken this straight from the Houghton Mifflin textbook. And the subtraction rule says anytime you're subtracting 2 numbers, you could think of it as adding the negative version of that second number. So for example, 3 minus 5 you can think of as 3 plus the negative version of 5, or in other words 3 plus -5. Some people find looking at it that way to be more helpful when they're subtracting with negatives. So a few examples just to make sure you get the point. 5 minus 3, we're saying it's the same as 5 plus -3. And 9 minus 6 we're saying is the same as 9 plus -6. And notice, whether you do it as an addition problem or as a subtraction problem, you get the same answer, 2 for the first, 3 for the second, in both cases. So let's put it to use. Let's find the differences in each of these 3 problems. Starting with A, -4 minus 3, we can think of that as -4 plus -3. If I put that -4 together with that -3, I should get -7. The hardest question on this slide is actually the second one, B. 10 minus 11. If I put 10 together with -11, the positive 10 cancel with 10 of the negatives, and I'm left with one more negative, or in other words, -1. The last one, 11 minus 10, this I'm sure feels like a question you learned back in elementary school. But if you want to, you can think of it as 11 plus -10, and just like you got in elementary school, you should get the answer 1. Now, in order to use the commutative property when you're subtracting with negatives, you need to look at one concept here. Remember that the commutative property says that I can switch the order. A plus B is the same as B plus A. Or back when I was talking about it on the previous video, I said 3/4 plus 1/4 is the same thing as 1/4 plus 3/4. This commutative property only works if all of the numbers that you're working on have the same operation, that they all have addition. So 3 plus -2 I can make into -2 plus 3 if I want. I can switch that order. And notice, this set of parentheses here that protected and kept the negative together with the 2 worked for me here, so that I remembered when I switched it that the negative stayed with the 2. But notice that only worked because I was talking about it as 3 plus -2. If I talked about it as simply 3 minus 2, I can't switch this order. I can't say 2 minus 3 is the same as 3 minus 2. Of course they're not. So it only works, again, the commutative property only works if you turn subtraction into addition using that subtraction rule that I talked about 2 slides ago. So let's put that idea to work here. I've got this expression here with 4 different numbers and operations between each of them. Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to change that double negative to positive. Once I do, I realize, wait, I've got 1, 2, 3 positive numbers that I'd like to group together, and then a negative number. This whole problem would be a lot easier if I could get the like terms next to each other. Well, the way to do that is to change -2 to plus -2. Once all the operations, 1, 2, 3, all of these operations are the same addition, I can change the order if I want to. And it becomes 3 plus 4 plus 8 plus that -2. These become much easier now to add. 3 plus 4 plus 8 make 15, and I've got 15 plus -2, which in other words is 15 minus 2, which is 13. Okay, now let's check and see how well you've understood all of this. Here are those last 4 problems, the hardest ones from the very first slide. Hit the pause button, try them one more time. Let's see how you do now. All right, I'm going to assume that you paused. Here are the answers you should get. If you don't, or if you have any questions about subtraction with negatives, don't hesitate to come in and bring them to class. I look forward to seeing you.